Barrington Area Conservation Trust. Preserve, restore, and inspire. Hi, my name is Navraaz Basati, and I'm the Conservation at School Coordinator for the Barrington Area Conservation Trust. And today, I'm going to do a basic rundown of one of our planet's biggest mysteries, soil. Soil is the growing medium from which a lot of our lives depend on. In fact, what happens inside our soil is largely responsible for our being able to live on Earth. Yet we still only understand a very small fraction of what goes inside of soil. So let's go over some of what we do know. And hopefully, I can inspire some of you to delve further into our mystery of mud. What makes up soil? What we know so far is that soil is made up of minerals, organic matter, living organisms, gas, and water. So some of the examples of this, minerals, we're going to go into this a little bit further, so I'll save that one for later. But organic matter is basically decaying matter that goes into our soil. Leaves, dead animals, root systems, all of that is considered organic matter. Then we get into the living organisms. One of the most famous living organisms, the earthworm. We always think of the earthworm when we think of soil. And then we look at gas. And one of the gases that we talk about often these days is methane that's being released into the atmosphere. And lastly, water. We know that rain is absorbed by soil, and so, that's also a big component. Now let's talk about that mineral content within soil. So depending on the mineral content, soil can take on different characteristics. So these types of soil are then classified into these categories of sand, silt, loam, and clay. And here you can see this really complex soil triangle. And it basically describes that, as the percentages of sand, silt, or clay increase or decrease, you start to see more of that characteristic of soil. And so what you're looking at in the center is where you get that loam soil. When you have a great balance of sand, silt, and clay, you get this loam soil, which is really the ideal soil that you want to be growing in. So now this next triangle kind of breaks it down in a little bit more simple way. It shows you that, what you're looking for that ideal growth for those root systems to be really given the space that they need in order to spread out and absorb the nutrients and water. In order to grow healthy, you need to have that nice mixture of those three types of soil that, results in this loamy soil that is the best growing soil. Now, let's talk about Illinois soil. So Illinois soil is actually a really, really good soil. And it's classified as drummer soil. So if anyone ever asks you, what is, Illinois soil? It is drummer soil. Drummer soil is named after Drummer Creek in Drummer Township. The characteristics of this soil, it is mostly formed of less and glacial drift. We'll talk a little bit about that glacial drift in a bit. Less is kind of a windblown sediment. And then it's got the soil or the deposits from that glacial drift. And, on top of that, we've got layers of organic matter from the prairies. 1.5 million acres of soil in Illinois is considered to be drummer soil. And like I mentioned before, it's a really productive soil. It has a lot of nutrients. It's fantastic for farming. And this is probably why, Illinois is part of the Midwest, known as the breadbasket. So because it is such a rich, nutrient-dense soil. And now here I'll talk very briefly about the glacial episodes in Illinois. There were 3 major episodes, and the glaciers did cover about 90% of Illinois. And then as these glaciers retreated, you would just imagine the earth moving. You would have all these rocks being deposited. You would have these moraines being created. And the most recent glacier was the Wisconsin glacier. And so as it retreated, it really changed the landscape of Illinois. So much of what you see today was influenced by these glacial episodes. And that definitely has a very important part to the history of our soil. Like I mentioned before, so we've got this glacial drift. We've got the wind-blown sediment that blows around and then settles on top of that as well. Now we've got this beautiful soil being brought on by the prairie plants. And what they're doing is, as they grow and die and then grow again, because many of them are perennial, they're leaving these kind of pathways inside the soil for insects to dwell and survive. They're leaving waterways. When they do die, they decay and they provide nutrient matter to the soil. So on top of the glacial drift, on top of the less, you're starting to see these layers of prairie soil rich in organic matter because of the plants that have existed there for hundreds of years. So what that results in then is this beautiful prairie soil. So as you can see in this picture, you kind of see this gradation. It's this beautiful set of layers. And here's where I want to talk about soil layers. And now here are those soil layers. You'll be able to see that, soil, we have broken down those layers into these definitions called horizons. So at the top, you have the O horizon, O for organic matter, and that's that, that fresh decaying matter at the top that's providing those great, nutrients to the soil itself. Then you've got the A horizon, which is the topsoil, and that's really where the plants grow, right? That's where they're able to kind of anchor themselves into. And then we've got the B horizon, and that's your subsoil going into your C horizon, your weathered rock. And then at the very bottom, you've got bedrock fragments. And so that's, no plants are reaching that level, but that's that breakdown of horizons within the soil. And here, this picture just makes it more simple to, and easier to understand. You've got organic layer, topsoil, subsoil, the parent material, also known as weathered rock, and then you've got your bedrock fragments. And this is just a great picture for you to be able to see some of those layers within the soil. So it's kind of like, cutting a piece of cake and being able to see the layers inside of it. That's really what this picture is. And now I'd like to introduce Virginia Brown. She's an environmental consultant, but also an extraordinary volunteer with BACT. And Virginia's specialty is studying soil to be able to understand how you can grow better.
So taking soil samples is, fun and everything, but there actually is a purpose. So in my job, I am an environmental consultant, and I do a lot of work on a ton of different types of projects. Sometimes I'm helping farmers. Other times I'm helping big energy companies build projects, whether that's a solar farm, a wind farm, a pipeline that's underground. And anytime you're building on the surface, you're probably doing some digging and soil mixing. So what has been very valuable for the industry is protecting the soil resource that they're working on, so that after the project is done, after you've built your solar farm, the ground underneath is not completely destroyed for future generations, and they're able to grow grass. So a lot of times I'll go out to a site and I'll take soil cores just like this, and I'll measure these topsoil layers. So on this soil, it might be about 8 inches, 9 inches, and I'll go back and tell the person building that site, hey, you have 8 inches of topsoil, so if you need to dig, level the ground at all, scrape off this layer, put it in a pile and save it, do all your grading, flatten the site, build a hill, whatever you need to do, and then spread the topsoil on top. Because if they don't, what happens is this layer ends up getting all mixed in with this lighter colored layer on the bottom, which has, it becomes really hard to grow anything later. They have a lot of erosion problems, and not only is that bad for the environment, it ends up costing a lot of money to fix. So it's helpful on two fronts. One, you're saving money by protecting the resource, and two, you're protecting the land for whatever might be on that property in the future. Once the solar farm or wind farm is gone, will you still be able to farm that land or have a pasture or whatever you need to do? This is the tool, just a soil coring probe that I use. We'll see that in action later. And then this is another tool I use for work, and these are used in golf courses and agriculture, but it measures soil compaction. The green zone, you push it into the soil. If you're in the green zone, the soil is loose. That means the roots can grow. As you move further into yellow and red, it's going to get harder to push down. You're entering some compacted soil layers. In an agricultural setting, if you're growing crops or in your garden, if you're hitting these layers, that means the plants that are growing in that soil are probably also having a hard time extending the roots through. All right, well, here we're in the woods next to a big old tree that's probably 50, 60 years old plus. And I chose this location because this old tree has been growing here for a while, which probably means the soil around it hasn't been disturbed as much. If you're up by my house, which is a little bit newer, when they're building, they move the soil around. You have a lot of equipment driving on it, so it's not going to be as natural as out here in the woods. So I'll do a couple little compaction tests. The bottom of this has a little pointy tip, and again, I'll be looking at this colored meter here, which is measuring PSI, kind of like a tire, pounds per square inch, and I'll see what I come up with. So I've hit a couple little rocks, and then actually, there we go. There's a little hard layer, and right about here, I'm going from green to yellow. Right between the green and the yellow, that's 200 PSI, or actually around 180. That's when roots start to not be able to extend as much once they start getting into this yellow. They can grow, but it's just a little more difficult. So that's where I would label about 12 inches below the surface. And you have to take like 4 or 5 tries to get one. There we go. So we have our topsoil up here, then we're moving into the subsoil layers, and way down here, this is where I was, with that compaction tester, I was hitting, we're about a foot deep here. We've got some rock fragments, and it's very hard clay. That's when you're getting into the deep subsoil. So again, up here, this is that topsoil layer. You have a little of the O horizon right here where we saw in the woods. That's just kind of roots and a little bit of partially decomposed grass clippings, something like that. And then our actual topsoil starting right around here. And again, I'm looking for that kind of nice crumbly layer. There's a lot of roots in here. That's indicative of topsoil. And we're still in the topsoil zone here. And then right here, it's starting to get a little chunkier. So it's not these little fine sand-like granules. It's more of a block. And I'm pressing, and it's pretty firm. And as I go down, we're going to get more clay down here. It's going to be more firm, and it's kind of starting to smear in the core a little bit. Even though it's dark, this is really where we're getting the color change, but this has a lot more clay in it. So this is subsoil down here. It's not, it's still useful for plants, but once we're getting down here in this light colored soil, see, I can make that streak. That's when you know you're really in a clay layer. This is true subsoil down here. And down here, it's very, very hard. I could barely get the probe past that. That's when you know you're in hard clay. So there are some differences in the forest and this pasture area. The pasture, we're going to have a little deeper topsoil, a little bit of less of that very dark organic horizon up here, but more topsoil layers and a little bit darker all the way through. Let's go down here where I have a I drive my truck, and the animals walk a lot, so it's probably going to be a lot more compacted. We compacted it on purpose so the rocks would stay on top and not sink in. And in general, I don't have much grass growing here because the soil is so hard. The roots are probably not going very deep either. This was down in the subsoil layer, and it's a very hard layer, and it has these areas of red, kind of rusty color, that's iron, and then these kind of dark gray colors. So when you see these features in a soil layer, that means there's a lot of water in the soil. This particular soil had a very unique property where it was not actually in a wetland or somewhere that was a swamp. It had a very, very compacted soil layer, a naturally occurring soil layer, at about 2 feet. And what happened was when it rains, the water would trickle down to the soil and hit that layer, that very hard layer at 2 feet, and water would just be ponding above it. So it would just be like a mini layer nested within a regular soil that happens to be wet. Below this layer, it was not wet at all. So that's kind of a unique property of this soil.
So now that we understand better how these layers of soil work, I do want to bring up one of the topics that Virginia mentions while she's going through the soil is that, there are issues of compaction. And at some point in time, while you're digging through the mud, you are going to get to those compacted layers. And what does that mean for our soil when it gets compacted? Does that compaction affect how things are able to grow? Does it affect the mineral content? Does it affect how water is able to access roots or how roots are able to access water? Let's look a little bit further into this issue of compacted soil. So here you can see from this infographic, you can kind of see what the difference is between good soil and compacted soil. Good soil is essentially soil where roots can dig through and access the nutrients they need in order to be able to have the plant itself grow. Compacted soil is where it is so tightly packed that the roots don't have anywhere to go. Therefore, they're kind of stuck. And once they get stuck, they really can't help the plant grow. So what causes soil to become compacted? Well, there's several reasons, but some of those reasons are using heavy machinery on top of the soil, such as tractors, foot traffic, people, animals constantly walking over the same place over and over again. You also have over-tilling in agricultural fields where you're constantly disrupting the soil by tilling it or by raking it up at deep levels where that organic matter is not able to just kind of settle in over time. And then working with wet soil. Working with wet soil is never a good idea because you really are messing with the nutrient levels in that soil. And now here you can see these kind of lasagna layers of soil here. This soil has been really compacted over time. And so what happens when the soil gets compacted like this, it doesn't contain the nutrition, that the plants need. And also it makes it very difficult for plants to grow, for root systems to be able to thrive in that compacted soil. So it's never a good idea to have, these practices that constantly put that kind of stress on your soil structure. So you could be thinking, well, how does that affect me, really? Because I'm above ground, right? Well, it affects everything. It affects our trees. It affects our, plants that we eat. Looking at this tree, you're seeing how weak it looks, in that compacted soil and how lush it looks when the soil is healthy. So it really does affect the overall health of our entire environment. And so here you can see a real life picture and it's sad. All the roots are kind of inching up and trying to look for that nutrition. They're overexposed. And so, they're not getting what they need. That tree is not going to stay standing for very long. So I'm hoping by now some of you are curious about the soil around the place where you live. It could be shared land, within an apartment complex. It could be your backyard. Well, if you're curious and you want to see, first of all, what kind of mineral content or how your soil could be characterized, here are a few ways that you could be testing your soil. There is this jar test. You could also do these other tests that, where you dig a hole and see how fast the water is absorbed into that hole. You may have higher clay content where your water isn't being absorbed, or you might have really sandy content where your water is quickly being absorbed into the soil. Once you know the type of soil that you have and you're able to see if there are layers of compaction, or if you're able to just assess from how much clay content you have, it's a good idea to start exploring some options that could increase the health of that soil. You could plant these incredible native plants. Now, some of the characteristics that these native plants have is that they have very, very deep roots that then are able to dig further through those layers to be able to access the nutrients that they need to grow. They're just a little bit sturdier than some of our non-native plants. And what this does is that it also contributes to the health of the soil by breaking it up. And then also once they die back, when they decay, they contribute to that organic matter that then increases the amount of nutrients within the soil as well. Now, in addition to planting those native plants, there are some other fantastic ways that you can contribute to the health of our soil. You could join a workday with Barrington Area Conservation Trust, where we not only plant plants, but we're also taking care of invasive species that can also be damaging to our soil health. You can join other environmental groups that work on creating healthy environments below ground as well as above ground. You can keep your lawns chemical-free. By not using pesticides, you can ensure the health of some of our insects that exist within the soil. Keeping them healthy is a big part of keeping the soil healthy. You can also make your own compost piles, which then, gives this awesome source of food to all of those insects and also those, different decaying components that take place underground. You can also leave your leaves on your lawn in the fall. If you don't gather your leaves, then what happens is they turn into that rich organic matter over the process of winter and then into spring. Now, I know I've covered a lot of material in this brief presentation on soil, and there is so much more that you could learn or that you could explore when it comes to soil, because even the top scientists don't understand it fully yet. So I hope this has, piqued your interest in this subject and that you will be curious about what lies beneath your feet.